Well, what we've been looking at in this series so far is basically the importance of visual culture and the way in which very, very strong messages of a particular regime are sort of crystallised in the clothes of the person who is at the pinnacle of that particular regime. And I suppose the point that I really am making is that when that regime no longer actually reflects the society that it was supposed to represent, you will see this in the change of the clothing of the person who is the main representor, in this case these three particular women. So when the style of Marie Antoinette, Josephine and Eugénie goes out, it really means that that regime has more or less run its race, and that something new is going to take its place. So clothes, as I said, are a very, very condensed visual metaphor of social change. Now, we saw that with Marie Antoinette, who, as we know, decided to represent herself as an individual rather than as a queen, was attempting to, in many ways, encapsulate in her body language, I suppose you could call it that, a change in society which really had been initiated with the age of the Enlightenment, with Rousseau, for example, and you know she wore those strange dresses, the chemises. However, she misinterpreted this because, I mean, let's face it, it was the message of the philosophers of the Enlightenment which will eventually bring down the Ancien Régime. So she was sort of with this message of the Enlightenment, but wasn't interpreting it correctly. She just went with the superficial things of going back to nature, but didn't really understand the profound significance that it meant for the monarchy. Josephine, we talked about as being a sartorial survivor. She survived literally by constantly changing her style until she married Napoleon, where her style literally represented the empire. But she, as you know, is repudiated, is divorced, when that sort of ethereal, carefree style that really represented the end of the revolution also goes out of style when Napoleon wants to see himself as an emperor and return to an incredibly not just structured political scene, but one which is sort of has references to the Ancien Régime. Now today we're going to speak about the Empress Eugénie, who comes at another pivotal time in this long 19th century. We're talking now about the time of the about 1848, 1850, when the Industrial Revolution is going to hit France, and it is a time of great change, of uncertain, fluid identities, and Eugénie is going to have to encapsulate in her clothing many of these sorts of messages. For example, she's going to have to encapsulate the idea of traditional values which seem to be going, right? When you've got this new society based on science which is racing ahead, everything is going to be changed. What's going to happen? It's women who incarnate traditional values. So she somehow has to, in the way she dresses, manage to get that message across. It's also this extraordinary rise of the middle classes, the rise of the bourgeoisie, where conspicuous spending is extremely important. And so the crinoline, with its yards and yards of material and its expansive skirts, is going to be ideal for this sort of environment. She also is going to have to portray the glamour of Paris, which Napoleon III, her husband, wants now to be the centre of Europe. All right, it's supposed to be the cultural, scientific and fashion centre of Europe, and so she has to portray this glamour, and all of this underpinned by the idea of progress and science. So in other words, she's really sort of has to juggle with the antithetical ideas of progress and tradition. And what I'm going to put to you today, basically, is that the crinoline, which is her creation and which will go out of style as the Second Empire also is weakened politically and economically and is about to go out of style. This crinoline represents this sense of stability, all right, which characterised the Second Empire, the sense of power, the sense of conspicuous spending, but also it codifies the role of 19th century women, all right? In other words, where they are sort of this pure person protected literally by their skirts. So this really is the point that I'm going to try and make. Now, I'm going to be talking about Paris itself very much. Now, a lot of you will sort of think, oh my God, not again. But it really, the skirts and the fashions that we're going to see are the reduced metaphor of Paris itself. Paris itself is going to be covered with monuments, covered with excess. The buildings are going to be covered in stucco, in gold and brass. The streets are going to be lined with all sorts of, with light glittering. And this is the same sort of thing with Eugénie's clothes. Enormous, monumental stability, and really basically what could be considered really bad taste. I mean, there was this, one of the sort of famous quips of one of the ambassadors to the French court at the time said, you know, ce n'était pas un empire comme il faut. It wasn't really a sort of quite a kind of really serious empire, but by God, we had a good time. And it was sort of known as the Carnival Empire. So I'm going to be sort of making the point very much talking about the development of Paris and what were the ideas underpinning the new Paris, all right, which throws out a whole old idea of society. All right, Paris is now this intensely urban centre, which is absolutely the power of France. All right, by now, up until the 19th century, you had other cities which were large, but didn't quite vie to the same extent as with Paris as they will in the 19th century. Now there is no question Paris represents a microcosmos of all that is French. So Eugénie then is going to come to power as her own woman in many ways. She doesn't have to juggle with the problems of the divine right of kings, you know, or what is it to be a queen. She doesn't have any of those problems. I mean, those have been solved more or less by Marie Antoinette. Bless her cotton socks. Then we have really, she has no role model except Josephine, who really isn't a role model at all, in the sense that she is divorced and thrown out at the end of the reign of Napoleon. So Eugénie is going to be someone who is going to be free to create a new image, and she is going to create the image of the Parisienne, right? This idea of chic, this idea of essential allure, which is going to bring people in their millions, literally their millions, to see these extraordinary women at the time of the Universal Exhibitions. So I wanted to start off, it's going to be the usual long sort of marathon lecture. I mean, I think it probably should be an Olympic event, you know, sitting through one of my lectures. Anyway, here we have, remember when we were talking about Marie Antoinette and we talked about the importance of the paired portraits, where the Queen only had status insofar as she was the first subject of the King, and there was always reference to him in the painting, looking at her and she looks at us. Well, we still have the same sort of facsimile of a paired set of portraits, you know, the Emperor and his consort, but she no longer, in this particular painting, makes reference to simply being the consort of the Emperor. Sure, she's pointing to the crown, but it's her crown. She's the Empress, I mean, and she shares power. In fact, she shared a huge amount of power, as we will see later. She's a very intelligent, shrewd woman who manipulated her husband very well. Right, now I just want to put you into the historical situation for a moment, because it's extremely important. We have this sort of iconic painting by Delacroix, which refers to the revolution of 1848. Right, now what is important here is that this is the end of the monarchies forever. All right, at the end of the Ancien Régime, you had Louis XVI being guillotined, then you have Napoleon coming back. Napoleon's thrown out, and you get Louis XVI's two brothers coming back to power. There's another revolution, 1830, they throw them out, don't know what to do, they put back the cousin of the Bourbon, who was the Duke of Orleans. Now he rules for about 15 years, it's relatively stable. Again, another revolution, 1848. Now you need to get this pattern of instability, and this is going to be very important for Napoleon III. What is important in looking at this is that you no longer have what is defined as the rabble leading the charge, but you actually have workmen alongside with the bourgeoisie and with people who were the little artisans around the Bastille area. So in other words, you're now getting this, the power base is, or even a revolutionary power base, is centred also in the bourgeoisie. So when Napoleon III comes to power, he is going to have to placate this particular group. So he cannot position himself simply as an aristocrat. Well, when Napoleon III comes to power, now don't forget that he has spent all his life in exile. When Napoleon I was defeated, all of his brothers and sisters that were in France were exiled. Those were already at the outside of France, could not come back in. So Napoleon III is a very interesting man, and he hasn't really been given his due historically. There's a huge resurgence of interest in him at the moment. Right? He was seen as this rather tubby little, sphinx-like person with funny moustaches and grey eyes. You could never quite understand what he was thinking, and people thought, well, maybe he wasn't thinking anything. In actual fact, he was extremely shrewd in his choices. Now, he was a polyglot. He had grown up in Switzerland. He'd been actually even gone to America. He'd spent some time in Italy, and then had finally gone into exile in England. And a lot of his concepts about what Paris should be was based on London at the time. So he speaks some Italian, he speaks excellent English, and he speaks good German. The only language that he doesn't speak particularly well is French. He speaks French with a heavy German accent, and of course when he finally comes back to power, we know what the French are like, unfortunately, excuse me, Caroline, but they do tend to think that often accents are a little bit funny. So here they are with Napoleon, their new leader, coming back, asking, which way is the Marais, because he doesn't know Paris. So he comes back knowing very, very well, and he's actually, when he's in exile, he writes a lot of socialist documents and becomes very interested in the working classes. There's going to be a real swing in the other direction when he comes, but he's an idealist in many ways. And he's very interested in medical ideas of the time, which talk about the importance of a city being like a human body, where you have to have movement, and we'll look at that in a moment. So when he comes back to power, he knows that the problem with all these revolutions is actually Paris itself. And so he immediately commissions the Baron Haussmann, who is an outsider like him. He's someone from Alsace, so he's of Germanic origin. He's a Protestant, and you must never underestimate the way in which the Protestants were kept out of all social affairs in France. And he gives to this engineer the plans that he himself has already drawn up for the total reconstruction of Paris. Now, this, at a time when the machinery that we have nowadays wasn't available, was an extraordinarily visionary idea, all right? And so this is based very much on a lot of these socialist ideas that he originally had, and which are going to morph into tyrannical ideas under his regime. A little bit like, Mussolini started out on the left, and let's face it, he toppled over the cliff of the right at the end. All right, now he also is shrewd enough to realise that he has to have a consort who is going to represent, on the in the microcosmos, these ideas that he is going to implement in Paris and in France, the new society, the new world, the new city. Originally, like his uncle, he wanted to make a marriage into the ruling families of Europe. He was rebuffed by the niece of Queen Victoria, who was one of the Hohensteins. He was rebuffed by one of the Austrian heiresses. And so he makes an announcement in the press that he's going to marry out of love, all right? And, it's a bit like politicians when they retire. They're going to spend time with their family. Yes, that's right. All right, so He clearly was very smitten with her, but this wouldn't have really been of any significance had he not thought that she was the right woman for the job. Now, who was she? She was Eugénie, the Countess of Teba. She was de Montijo. On her father's side, she came from the grandees of Spain. All right, Spanish blood, the Guzman blood, very high aristocratic blood going back to years, centuries. On her mother's side, and this is really very interesting, she was half Scottish, right, which probably accounts for the blue eyes and this extraordinary auburn hair which was her trademark, and even the dolls that are produced after her imitate. So she was, on her mother's side, she's quarter half Belgian and half Scottish. Kirkpatrick was her name. But it's also rumoured as well that in actual fact her father was not the Duke Guzman, but quite possibly an Englishman who was an ambassador at the time. Who knows? Whatever it is, that she was a great beauty. She was sent. It's very, very interesting. Her mother was a beauty herself, and realised that good looks really mean that you can go places. And a bit like the Kennedy sisters, actually, they were sort of raised very, very carefully to marry at the top. I remember one of them married into the Radziwiłł family, and the other one married into the Kennedys. The same thing with these two girls. The elder sister becomes the Duchess of Alba, which is about as high as you can go if you're not actually the king or queen. And Eugénie was toted a little bit around the courts of Europe looking for a crowned head. She'd been sent to do her schooling in Paris, because this was still, Paris already was the place where you had learned polish, you learned chic. And she went to the School of the Sacred Heart, now of which we have a version up here in Glen Iris. And for those who weren't on the Spanish tour, remember Kathleen McCarthy was from the Sacred Heart. So this was a French teaching order, an aristocratic order, which spread throughout Europe. And it was really a very high intellectual level. And also on the weekends she used to do gymnastics. I mean, she was quite an unusual woman. So this was one of the first women virtually in Paris to take an interest in the sort of physical culture. And when she went back to Spain, she used to ride to the hunt in an Amazon, we spoke about this, in trousers, was a great bullfighting aficionado. We'll gloss over that anyway. But she wasn't sort of your kind of cute wilting violet or old-fashioned victim that she's often supposed to be. So her great beauty and her wit in many ways aided her. But she also, Napoleon III, for all his short stature and equivocal gaze, was one of the great sort of Casanovas, or like to think of him as one of the great Casanovas of the time. Nothing that moved was safe. And when he actually met her several times, there's a great sort of scene where she's on the balcony and he's saying, "Madam, how can one get to you?" And she says, "You have to go through the chapel, sir." Anyway, as my mother said, well, it certainly worked, and she became the Empress of France. Now, the English had a field day on this. This is, as they often do, here was a cartoon, The Eagle in Love. Here's this sort of Spanish senorita clipping his claws, and here's the poor old eagle. The eagle, of course, being the symbol of Napoleon. The English were very chuffed, because they said the French were rather dismayed that he didn't marry someone into the real ruling heads of Europe. And so the English said, "Ho, ho, ho, the French don't like it," as if, marrying a countess from the ancient lineage of Spain wasn't good enough for an upstart like the Bonapartes, all part of the little snide cartoons that went on between the two countries. All right, so I'm going to now look at the way in which this particular woman is given the job of representing all of these new ideas that are coming in. And what I'm going to emphasize here is the need to project a concept of stability and power, and this is what she is going to do with her clothes. Now, I want to talk about the way in which Paris is reconstructed and the ideas behind it, and it does relate very much to the clothes. I'm not just going off onto my pet topic, right? When Napoleon comes to power, he deliberately raises the centre of Paris. But with great methodology, he sends out a photographer to take photos of what he is going to destroy. So there's very much this concept of wanting a reference to the old world. You know, this is what I got rid of. You know, it's not just, oh look, we'll get rid of this and that. It's a real sense of a new era in civilization. And this is this old idea with the dirty streams and the hovels and the infections, the cholera epidemics and so on. And he's going to turn it into this, a city which is structured, absolutely dominated by geometrical structure, where everybody knows their place. You look up this massive boulevard. There is an arc there. There's a monument there. You know, if you turn to the right, it's over there. You are centred, and sort of as a citizen in Paris, you are controlled by the urban structure. I just want to show you the way in which he went about this. Entire parts of Paris, and it wasn't just the slums in the centre which were pulled down. He pulled down beautiful 18th century buildings in the way. Anything that got in the way of a straight line was actually removed. Now, before I actually talk about the ideas behind these boulevards, I just want to show you this is what was achieved in the 20-odd years of his reign. Now, the Rue de Rivoli, this is all of his structures, all of his streets. Now, if you look at them, they are the main streets of Paris. Paris has not really changed since. This Rue de Rivoli partially existed, and it was his uncle, Napoleon I, who was the only other person who had taken any interest in the structure of Paris. The kings didn't care. Right? I remember until then they'd been at Versailles, Paris got on with itself. When the kings were restored, they were still only interested in their own aristocratic spaces. Whereas these two emperors, the Bonapartes, are the people who will create Paris. So this is what he's going to do is particularly get rid of all of the slums that are in the centre around here, around the Ile de la Cité, all around there, as you can see, and put a straight line through, all right, which opens Paris up from the west to the east, and then he is going to then open it up from the north to the south. All right, and there's a slight hiccup here because it doesn't go quite straight across. All right, then on the other bank, he's going to open up the Boulevard Saint-Germain, which goes through all of those revolutionary quarters. Now, when you actually go and look at the statue of where Marat used to live, you know, where was the French Revolution, you have to sort of really take pictures and ask your people to have powerful imagination, because there's nothing left. It was just completely demolished, and in its place, these huge boulevards. Now, it wasn't just the boulevards themselves, but you had these immense turning points, as you can see, which meant that you could have like these starbursts of boulevards going out. Now, this just wasn't for aesthetics. It was also, he put military barracks around here as well, so that if there was an insurrection, these military people could pour out here and here, or here, here, here and here, and any riots would be put down very quickly. And that he needed it, I can assure you. All right, now we get then to his main work, and again, this is going to relate very much to the kind of clothing that people will wear at the time. You couldn't wear a crinoline if you were in a tiny little alleyway. You'd get stuck, all right? So basically, I mean, it's just a very crude reference to the fact that now you have a city which is opened up. And there are a number of things which he wants to do. Now, the first thing with these boulevards is that it's related to medical theories of the time, all right? You have to have movement of air. Movement is the essence of modernity, all right? And everything moves on the boulevard, and that's what I'm going to talk about in a moment. And in fact, this idea of constant change, Baudelaire's idea of modernity being fixed in the fleeting encounter is very important. All right, so what you have here is the movement of air, the movement of light, but particularly transport, which is the movement of people. And if you actually start to look at these Impressionist paintings, not, oh, that's pretty, but what actually is he highlighting? What has really struck Pissarro from his vantage point up high? It's the openness, the open city, and movement of crowds, right? So this is the new thing, what happens with the Industrial Revolution, crowds which have to be moved from one place to another. So not only do the boulevards represent safety, all right, because you can have you can shoot a cannon down a boulevard, you can bring the cavalry down a boulevard, which you couldn't down the tiny little streets. But you can also use these boulevards for ceremonies to show the power of the regime. But more important than that, you have the movement of people, the movement of goods, all right? This is the new economy of things being brought into Paris, Paris manufacturing and taking them out. But all of this also gives you the movement of ideas, all right? So transport, light, movement of ideas, and the importance, I suppose, again, of light. Right, the city of light is not just these lampposts that you see, which will be dotted everywhere, and which are the invention of Baron Haussmann. Up until then, Paris was not lit at night. You'd have an occasional lantern, which would only be put on a night when there wasn't any moon. And if you had a moon and the cloud went across the moon, the place was totally dark. So now you get Paris, which starts to live at night, all right? And in fact, that gets rid of a whole lot of the rag pickers who used to live at night and come around the street and pick up things and recycle them. So it's a whole different way of experiencing the city. And it's an important one because women now can experience this safe space, all right? You still have the division of women staying at home in the boudoir and being out in the public sphere, but now they can come out into this safer place where there are footpaths. I just wanted to give you again this idea, it's constantly driven home to you by the Impressionists, always taken from a high vantage point to give this sense of majesty, of monumentality, of these huge roads going off literally into the horizon. And these are even, someone's taken postcards were even taken in the same way at the time, which I think is really quite significant. You don't have people sort of standing on the footpath taking photos of people going past. It's this sense of majesty, of huge crowd movements. It wasn't just movement above the soil or above the boulevards with their paved streets, but also movement underneath, which was the invention of the sewer system, and that was something which had never existed before. People used to throw their refuse into the streets, therefore there were epidemics. So you've got this idea of the city as a human body. You get the arteries, which we still talk about the arteries being blocked, you know, which are the main streets, and that is like blood running through the body. This was based on Harvey's system of blood continually working through the body. So it was all based on medical theories, this urbanism. Underneath you have the bowel system, all right, which the intestines which evacuate all the waste goods. And on the, I'll talk about those in a minute, you also get the lungs on this outside of Paris, which are the parks. Now I just wanted to again show you this importance of movement and monumentality with the Gare Saint-Lazare by Monet. The railway stations now are almost like the new palaces, all right? You have a new kind of architecture. Trains, of course, are the essence of movement because people now are moving at an incredibly high, well, probably 40 kilometres an hour. But reality is broken up. All right, it's no longer just something that you look at and can fix and can put on a painting. This is why the Impressionists, one of the reasons why you get this broken brush stroke and you get these fleeting visions, is it because people now live in a society of mechanical movement. The trains were really important also with the idea of uniting France. I mean, for the first time, they actually had to have clocks in Paris, which were the same as the clocks in Marseille. And so you actually get a unified time space. And people also from Paris went down to Marseille. Until then, they knew more about the people from, you know, the Zulus than they did about the people who lived in Marseille. So you get this sense of national identity. All right, so again, this idea of the monumentality and the new city. Now, I want to emphasise here what has Caillebotte highlighted here. It's the girders, all right, the steel girders. And we're going to see this again appearing in the steel structures that will come to support the crinolines of Eugénie. So what I'm trying to say is that ideas in a society are all perfectly coherent. They're just simply expressed in different modes. Again, the dynamism of this new city, with this importance of the flaneur. Here we have this dynamic person, this upper class person, moving across a space out of the picture space, again in this sort of, in the Place de la Concorde. Again, the bourgeoisie now dominating, the class now which is interested in showing its rank, conspicuous spending. I'll just quickly go through these. Of course, that's on the outside. This is the bourgeoisie on the inside. This is actually Caillebotte's mansion near the Parc Monceau, one of the receptions that he would have had. Now, these people were avid to show their rank, and this, of course, will be later than the crinoline era, when the bustle has been pushed to the back. We'll get round to that. All right, so what then I'm trying to say is that the buildings that now grace this city of movement, of gigantic spaces, this new city embracing science and technology, Napoleon III wants to grace it. He has very clearly this idea of it being the centre of Europe. And so this, I think, architectonically is the exact equivalent of the crinoline. An enormous building decked out in yards, literally, not of materials, but every possible kind of marble with every possible kind of gilt, you know, and so on, in every possible style. Sitting conspicuously at the end of an avenue that doesn't even have any trees, because you don't want to take away from it, lit up, as you can see, by these new clusters of lighting. And Napoleon III was very clear that when you came to a large intersection, you suddenly had these starbursts of light. All right, if you were in a single street, you had one single lamp, in a more important street two, and by the time you got to a big spot, you'd say, my God, this must be important because I can count 5, 6 or 7 lamps. So it was a very clear symbolism, which is not unlike the way people will dress. Staircases become immensely important. Making an entrance is incredibly important. Why? Because the class which is going to represent and support this industrial revolution, the captains of industry who are right behind Napoleon III, are going to be the people who have to be seen. They have no rank, they're not aristocrats, but it's in their accoutrements, and particularly in what their wives wear, that they are going to hold rank. So there's no point in holding rank and having a wife whom you probably don't have anything to do with and looks fabulous if you can't show her off on a staircase. So in the interior architecture and outside in the city, you have parks, department stores, everything, magnificent staircases. I think this one in the Opera House, wonderful. It's worth going to the opera just to see it. Now the same thing happens at I'm just showing you that this happens even in railway stations. This is the Musée d'Orsay, which of course was a railway station. It also has these massive rooms, wonderful restaurants and ballrooms where people can parade, and where mirrors are there, where you get this infinitesimals, or at least this image of the person going through to eternity. The big stores now, which now sell ready-made clothes, these fashions are going to now be able to be they're going to be produced by Eugénie, but they will be able to be made and mass-produced, and so even down to the working classes who will perhaps be able to, you know, get them, no longer have to get them second-hand from the market. They can actually go to these cheaper stores or department stores, but even these department stores are massive. As you can see here, everything at this time takes on this gigantic image. So this is the power of women. I just want to show you. All right, now what are we up to here? All right, I was just going to show you the importance of the gardens as well, of places where you can be seen wearing these fabulous clothes. So even in the little parks, that's what I was going to show you. Right. I was going to show you the parks. Napoleon III gives these woods on either side of Paris over to the city to develop as showplaces. And this is where the races are going to be, and again the bourgeoisie can show their wealth. And it's almost like lungs on either side. You have one in the north, the Parc Monceau, and the Parc Montsouris in the south. So this is where the bourgeoisie are going to gather. You will know this La Musique aux Tuileries by Manet, showing this upper class hobnobbing out in the public spaces of Paris. However, this Paris that we have seen, which has become monumental, been given over to developers, to the bankers, to the rising classes of shop owners, also has its other side. And you are going to see these working class people who have been pushed to the outskirts of Paris at the end of the Second Empire in 1870 will have their revenge, and this is going to be the worst and the bloodiest civil war revolution in Paris of all time. The 1871 Commune, when the working classes take over Paris, come down from their slums on the outsides, repossess the centre, and when they are slaughtered by their own government, who comes in from Versailles to kill them, set fire to these great monuments which had been established by Napoleon III. So this revenge, it's still the same generation of people who had been expelled from the centre. But in the meantime, you've got these working class people who now are dressing and managing to infiltrate via the system of courtesans which will flourish under Napoleon III. Napoleon III was a great aficionado of a bit of horse flesh, and he probably frequented most of these well-known women we will see later. But you're going to get this this ambiguity now of this new city, and it's referenced very much by Manet, who in this bar at the Folies Bergère shows us the difficulty of actually working out who you are and where you are. I mean, you appear to be looking at this woman front on, but obviously you're not, because this is her back over there. So therefore, we should actually be over here. But we're not, we're looking at it from there. Well, are we this person, and what is the interaction that we're having this woman? Is it all just a commercial interaction? Is he asking for a drink, or is he asking for something else? This place which seems to be behind her, in actual fact, is behind us, and that's a mirror. Do you know what I mean? Space and relationships are all very much sort of flou, are very uncertain. And indeed, this is what the city of Paris was like. So all the more important to have a dress style which is going to speak very clearly of power. Meanwhile, just quickly back on the outer boulevards, this is what has happened to the working class. They have become degenerate, they've become drinkers, and this whole reference to women, this is what happens when you let women out from the home. They go, they get drunk, and they're still sitting there drunk at dawn. You know, people are wanting to give these creatures the vote. All the medical ideas that if you drink, you're going to produce these mad children. The children are going to be tiny, they're never going to be able to fight the Germans across the border, for heaven's sake. I mean, catastrophe. So the answer to it all, that you've waited very patiently for 3/4 of an hour, is going to be this sort of massive campaign from the top of the fashion created by Eugénie. And even though there were large skirts had come back after the French Revolution, nothing on the scale had existed until you get, in the 1850s, Eugénie being married and coming to power. Now, this is probably the emblematic painting of the time. Eugénie with her ladies-in-waiting. And what I'm going to talk about a little bit now is the way in which women are perceived. And remember this sort of juggling that she has to make between the empress as a traditional womanhood as keeping together the old ideas of the sacred nature of motherhood and religion, and at the same time being modern, all right? So here you have women as flowers, basically, aren't they? I mean, they're emerging from they're petals, basically, of their crinolines. Yards and yards and yards and yards of material, looking absolutely enchanting, but my goodness, would you want to wear one? Now, one thing before we get to talk about this is that one person who was admired immensely by Eugénie was none other than Marie Antoinette. And at the time of the Second Empire, the balls that they had were practically all fancy dress balls. And Wirth, as we're going to see, the great dress designer, will be the person who creates practically all of the dresses for these fancy dress balls. He worked night and day, made a fortune. But the most popular person that everyone dressed up as was Marie Antoinette, and this is the Empress Eugénie as Marie Antoinette. So it's really sort of interesting the way in which she's going to take aspects of the Marie Antoinette story but produce them in her own way. All right, so the Empress now is going to show herself as upholder of traditional feminine values, the representation of France's modernity, the stimulator of French economy, and that's extremely important when we're going to look at the yards of material, and also the beacon of the city of light, glamour, in other words, all right? So she's going to really take back that sort of glamour that Marie Antoinette originally had. So we're going to talk about monumental spaces and monumental skirts. Well, I've already made that connection there. I wanted to sort of show you this cartoon, which I think is most amusing. Where a lady at a dinner party with this immense skirt has to be served by someone with, it looks a bit like a pizza tray. Now, if you look beyond that, I want you just to look at the cupola of the Galeries Lafayette and see the way in which sort of municipal architecture, in many ways, even though this was built slightly later, it was a copy of what there was at the time, is not dissimilar, this idea of the circle, of the cupola. I just want to take you through a number of these things. Les dames du demi-monde n'ayant pas de demi-jupe. This is a demi-monde, the courtesans, but they haven't got a half skirt. Now, if you remember Marie Antoinette not being able to get into a carriage because of the headdress, you've now got people who can't get into carriages because of their skirts. And so you get, technology hasn't actually caught up with this widening and ever widening width of the skirts. And here we have a wholesome conclusion. Lady Crinoline, yes, love, a pretty church, but the door's certainly very narrow. And you'll notice the way the husband's totally dwarfed by these two ladies. All right, now we have the Princesse de Broglie, who was one of the great sort of fashion ladies of the time, from the aristocracy. Now, this is by Ingres. I've used it because he's a great painter of materials. Now, what do we actually have here? What is the message? Well, it is the woman as a sort of a sacred object to be looked at, all right? Women weren't, remember, the function of these upper class women, or the bourgeoisie, was to represent wealth, represent status. They were not supposed to work, you know. The less function or ability to actually carry out normal movements, the less you were able to do that, the higher your rank. And so the crinoline represents this inability to be able to move correctly. All right, now people had these enormous skirts, originally with petticoats underneath, which meant that you really couldn't walk, because you had to go through a mountain of horsehair, and because the word crinoline comes from crin, meaning horsehair, which were these sort of skirts. Also, to make your crinoline move correctly, you had to walk sort of pigeon-toed, so that you ended up with this sort of enchanting sort of sway of the crinoline. A bit like I was walking behind someone actually in Richmond the other day on incredibly high heels, and it actually makes women's backsides move incredibly. I was sort of quite fascinated. I was thinking, probably thinking this pervy old lady, but it just sort of suddenly occurred to me that this sort of mincing walk and the way in which women are still now young women are putting themselves back in these sort of binding clothes is very similar to this sort of doing anything to get the walk, Striding along with manful strides is definitely out. So, all right, so you had this idea of femininity as being connected with uselessness. Right? And remember, I mean, some of my other lectures, we sort of showed that there was the cult of invalidism. The more invalid and sort of ethereal you were, the less you were connected to bodily urges, that, you know, and therefore the purer you were. So men came home to this pure woman who was at home, not sullied by the outside world, right? So you have the spaces of the woman and the interior spaces of the house, the outer spaces of commerce in the city. It's very interesting the way in which the shoulders are left bare to be able to wear extraordinary jewellery. All right, there's no point in, again, this was very important, to show wealth. You had to be able to show these diamonds and different stones that were now being brought in from the French colonies, right? This is a time of great colonial expansion, and so you're getting emeralds and sapphires being brought in and cut now as well. And so you need to have a dress which gives you an expanse of neck to be able to wear this. All right, so protecting this idea of womanhood. Now, the person who is going to come to power at this time, and we've actually spoken about two other people who were great couturiers, was Rose Bertin and her role in many ways in the fall of Marie Antoinette. Leroy, or Leroy as he's called now, was the person who urged Josephine constantly to keep buying, but it wasn't his style which was so important, whereas Wirt is extremely important in the story of Eugénie and the spread of French fashion now throughout the world, because it's under the time of Eugénie with the new developed steamships, right? The Industrial Revolution means that communications are much quicker, and so the catalogues from the new stores which are being built are going to go to the New World. And of course, no respectable debutante in, the Habermayers and everyone in New York or Boston would ever make an entrance without her Wirt. You know, and they've actually got paintings of people, sort of a young girl clutching her eyes and saying, oh, her first Wirt, you know, looking at the first gown and so on. Now, who was Wirt? He was an Englishman who very cleverly realised that things were happening much quicker on a bigger scale in Paris. Goes to Paris to works with Gagelin in a draper's shop, which was originally, of course, just selling material. There he marries one of the women who actually models the shawls and starts designing dresses for her. And people would come into the shop and sort of say, look, you know, where did you get your dress? And she would say, look, it's my husband. And he realises very clearly that there is a market for a great, you know, someone who had flair in this society of show, of this society of ostentation, of conspicuous spending, where balls and, you know, the court is trying to sort of show its splendour. And so he has the brilliant idea, this is her wearing one of his clothes. In fact, any of the Winterhalter paintings that you see are always Wirt dresses. He was the first person who actually put his brand on. He used to sew Wirt on the back. Now, who is this? This is the Princess Metternich, who was born into a Hungarian aristocratic family and marries her uncle, the Austrian diplomat Metternich. He is the Austrian ambassador at the court of Napoleon III. Now, she was an extraordinary little woman, supposed to be really ugly, but she has that, what the French call that, you know, un joli laide, you know, that she's got something, you know, it's not just the physical features, but she had great wit, you know, and charm, which of course is something that the French put probably much more emphasis on than Anglo-Saxon societies do. You know, it's much more the sort of the nose and so on. The French have got this idea of this inner self. And she actually says, you know, I'm the best dressed monkey in the court of Napoleon III. And in fact, if you actually, she's been Winterhaltered there. Better than Botox, I think, really. So this is a painting by Degas, and this is actually a photograph of what she looked like. Now, she was the trendsetter. She was the one who had the edge in the court. Great friends of Eugénie. Eugénie, by the way, who is a very, very staunch Catholic, and this is going to come through in many of the political blunders that Napoleon III is going to stumble into. Anyway, she is persuaded. Wirt sends her a dress that he has designed and manages to have himself admitted to her and says, look, would you please take this as a homage? Would you please wear it to the ball tonight? And because she's such a kind of a unusual little character. I mean, most of the other women of the court would have just sent him on his way, this funny little dumpy Englishman, but she's sort of always playing practical pranks and things like that. She sort of thought, oh, why not? Let's do it as a hoot. And, of course, the dress is a great success, and Eugenie's a bit jealous because everyone's looking at the Princess van Metternich's dress. Who does your clothes? And then summons Wirt up, and he will become the official couturier to the Empress. Now, there's another story where he actually will bring her free of charge again, the Empress Eugenie, her first dress, which is in heavy brocade, and she actually doesn't like it, and is about to tell him more or less to go away, and the Emperor came in, and Wirt very cleverly says, look, you know, Emperor, whatever you call the Emperor, Your Highness, this material is hundreds and hundreds of yards of material and brocade from Lyon, and you are going down to Lyon on your next political campaign. This is a wonderful way of showing, you know, of stimulating the industry. And so, it's a good idea. The dress is bought, 3 more are bought, and she goes down to Lyon. Great success of the appearance of the Emperor and the Empress there. So, in many ways, it seals the fate of Wirt as being number 1. Now, this is the Princess von Metternich. Now, she also is going to be the one who always is a step ahead. She is going to be the one who will eventually, in the 1860s, oh, I haven't got it yet, 1868, which is very close to the end of the Second Empire, asks, or with Wirt, decides that they're going to abandon the crinoline and are going to push the fullness of the skirt to the back, which will then eventually, by the Belle Epoque, end up as a bustle. And in many ways it actually makes life even more difficult for women, as we'll see. All right, now this is the kind of society that Wirt was designing these dresses for. White was the colour that you had to wear if you went to a ball, and all of the ladies of the court had to have a Wirt dress in white. So the symphonies of white, the different materials, the different structures, the extraordinary invention of this man was amazing. And in that photograph that you had of him, you'll notice that he's wearing a little velvet beret and a cravat. He's actually trying to present himself no longer as just a dressmaker, but as an artiste. All right, now, we're now actually going to look then at this style that he, in conjunction with Eugenie, is going to make famous. All right, now this was what the petticoats used to look like underneath the dresses until the crinoline, the steel crinoline, which Eugenie is responsible for, is going to be developed. All right, so the crinoline, the huge skirts existed, but what Eugenie is going to do is make it modern. She's now going to use science and the girders of those bridges on a small scale to produce wonderful metal structures around the woman. All right, so here you see this new style of metal holding out the upper layer of clothing, which meant you could have very, very heavy upper layers of clothing with flounces and all sorts of things which you couldn't have before. So if you try and remember what the opera house looked like, encrusted with every possible style, now you can actually, and that was built on the basis of having a steel structure inside. So now the same thing with skirts, incredible overkill on tassels, bows, anything, you name it, because it is supported by a steel frame. All right, so this then is not only do you actually have to emphasise the hips, but this is this idea of women as being untouchable. All right, by now a woman is totally protected by her skirts, and a man really cannot touch her. This is a time of you know, women as their only sexual role was to be mothers. That was what a real woman was. They weren't interested in anything else. And indeed, Eugenie certainly wasn't interested in much else. She had one child, she did what she had to do, and that was it. All right, he just had to figure out what he was going to do by himself. Now, in the meantime, this emphasis on this female shape is brought about by extraordinary corsetry. And you can see what is really bad at this time is that with the development of the shops, they now filter down from the top right down to the bottom. All right, so this is when you set fashion now in 1850, 1860, everyone can follow you, not just the wealthy. And so here you get, doesn't matter what shape, you know, blonde, brunette, redhead, or sort of vaguely sort of overweight, you still can wear a corset. And people were beginning to get very worried about what this did, and particularly the later corsets that were later introduced when the dresses were pulled to the back, what's called the S-bend. The Edwardian ones were even worse. You can see the displacement of all of the main organs around here. This is why women, of course, fainted. They couldn't breathe properly. And so this reinforced the idea of women as being decorative creatures, but they're useless because they keep falling over. All right, so do you know what I mean? It was sort of art imitating nature, imitating art, and sort of reinforcing a vicious circle, really. Women, there were whole stacks of new female ailments that were produced by the medical profession to show that, you know, how hopeless women were, and one of them was green disease, you know, which was constipation and all of that sort of thing, because you had virtually no intestines working. Also, it wasn't just, as I was saying, it wasn't just Eugénie who uses this, but also the equivalent world of the courtesan. So you've got the great respectable world of the court and the upper bourgeoisie dressed to the nines, and then you've got the kind of imitation of that with the courtesans. And here was one of the great courtesans of the time, Cora Pearl, who also was English. There's a huge infiltration. I think her name was Jane Smith or something, but she produces this wonderful name. She was the courtesan of the time. She had a bracelet with all of the, you know, things of all the crowned heads of Europe. She was simultaneously maintained by the cousin of Napoleon III, the Duke Demidoff, and some Eastern potentate. And here she used to dye the dogs the same colour. This dog, it's a whippet, but he doesn't look very well, does he? I think we'll just move on. We now have, Eugénie now becomes a fashion plate, very much the way Marie Antoinette did, and she allows images of herself to appear. But you'll notice that even though she's wearing this extraordinary crinoline, she's actually outdoors, and she was very much a woman who enjoyed outdoor activities, and this dog looks a down sight better than the other one. All right, so this then, we're now going to get the hugely important press coming into play, and Le Moniteur des Dames. There's an explosion of fashion magazines showing the importance of the crinoline, but also showing the way in which women are perceived. You know, this idea of sort of, you know, thinking, you know, is there anything in my mind to think about? I mean, the whole idea was the dumber you were, the more attractive you were. You know, there wasn't supposed to be too many thoughts going through one's mind. And besides, if there was too much blood going to your head, it wasn't going to your uterus, and you weren't going to produce, you know, reasonable-sized kids. So the vaguer you looked, the better. You know, and in this sort of slightly sort of, you know, it's nature, but it's a very contrived nature. Now, I just wanted to get this portrait of Eugénie by Winterhalter. A commanding presence, even in this situation. The shoulders on which the empire's wealth was supposed to be shown off, this wonderful sloping shoulders that were supposed to be produced. And I think because of the way in which your corset pulled you back, I think it actually, I can't remember the ins and outs of it, but it actually, the way in which they were held there means that you pull your shoulders down. I don't know. Anyway, this face here will be reproduced on porcelain doll faces. So remember, we had those first fashion magazines that used the image of Marie Antoinette. Now you actually have Eugénie dolls, and they are dressed in the latest fashions of the day, and sent to the four corners of the world, in particular to America. Now, often these dolls are even not life-size, but they're very large, or little girls would have a trousseau with these extraordinary outfits. And I was lucky enough, I was in Paris last year in December, and there was an exhibition at the Galerie Museum, which was called Under the Empire of Crinolines, and it had all of the crinolines that had been borrowed from leading families, and had this little set of dolls which had been used to sort of you know, advertise Paris fashions. Now remember, we had that idea already with Marie Antoinette, remember? Now I just want to show you, of course, by the 1860s, the crinoline has gone. All right, now the crinoline, the stability the size, the attitude to women, the conspicuous spending, all of that is now sort of, it's no longer really represents what's happening in France of the Second Empire. What's happened, there are a number of wars, France is being defeated, and the majesty, the giant, and tentacles of the French Empire are no longer what it was. And in many ways, you now get a style of dress which is very different. You get a pared away style, still yards of material, but the bustle has, at least the skirt has been brought to the back, will gradually thin down. You get less space, and it is less stable. All right, you've now got a sort of a silhouette in the front, you've got yards and stuff at the back, and it is very difficult to walk. Now, if you thought it was difficult to walk with a crinoline, when you've actually got something pulled around your hips here, and you've got this huge thing at the back, and pulled back with the corset, I mean, it's amazing they even knew how to breathe. So I think this sort of really represents this social malaise as well as other things. Now, I just wanted to show you the importance of science and technology going back to the crinoline in 1850s, 1860s. This is what it was like to get dressed, all right? You stood there, you couldn't get dressed yourself. I mean, excuse me, dear, I'll just slip into something more comfortable. You had to sort of have a maid who would help you, all right? No woman could go anywhere without a lady's maid. And so here we have the structure, which will keep people a mile away from you. Then people stand up on chairs with sort of kind of prongs and bring this down over you, and it's already been covered in a series of petticoats. Now, there are a number of problems inherent in this. They were so huge here. Of course, what is this? An unexperienced flight, and experience. Even the sun, unexpected. Even the sun thinks it's a joke. Here she's holding onto the post because she's been blown away. Now, this actually isn't just sort of someone's fertile imagination. There were a number of deaths of women who were blown off cliffs. If you're standing too close and the wind actually gets up your skirts, literally, the volume of the skirt is enough to actually pull you over the edge. And it wasn't even that. People, not regularly, but it was a known hazard to be anywhere near a fire, because if something falls out of the fire and catches all of these yards of gauze and everything catches light, there's no way you could get the woman out of the crinoline in time to extinguish the fire. So a number of people actually died in these outfits. And in fact, there's actually a church, Notre-Dame de la Consolation, which is down near Alma-Marceau, if anyone's going there, which is dedicated to, I think it's something like 50 or 60 ladies of a charity, a bazaar. It was the fire of the bazaar. These ladies all indulged in charity organisations, and I think they had one of the very first cinemas, at least the first film, celluloid film, and that caught alight. And all of the inside of this decorated charity bazaar went up, and the women in their crinolines with it. And in fact, whole families of women, and often her 3 daughters, died. And we've got these beautiful statues of women, sort of, it's all dedicated to the dangers of crinolines. And here you've got something about perspective. Here you go, someone trying to ride side saddle, people trying to have a picnic, and here's someone who's actually got out of the door, caught her crinoline on the door, and has come a bit of a cropper. So it was it was difficult to actually be ladylike and manoeuvre and do anything. Go to the toilet, can you imagine? Well, you couldn't. I mean, people just used to have to push things under your skirt. Sorry, we've got the resident male here, so I won't go into it, but that's the sort of thing you had to do. All right, so here we have gown for court presentation. Again, yards of material, this idea of the thing. Here, women trying to use, to be flirtatious, and of course to be flirtatious was to actually show a bit of ankle. And so here she's sort of saying, what's the effect now, dear? Look, charming, you can flirt a little bit more, you can go up a little bit more, and people will see your ankle. So this. All right, now it wasn't just in the steel structures that you get the modernity, and you get this, and also in the yards of material which echo the monuments and the structures of Paris. But also modernity is expressed in the new dyes that are being developed. at this time. You now, rather than have vegetable dyes, which are unstable, you now are getting the aniline dyes, which are very, very bright colours, and materials were produced in extraordinary bright colours. And to tell you the truth, it's a little bit disillusioning when you finally are confronted with these dreams of crinolines and you see them and they're absolutely garish. The white ones are probably all right, but they don't seem to have survived. But the ones I saw were, you really need dark glasses. Now, one of the colours which was developed at the time and became the signature colour of the Empress Eugénie was purple, and this was known as Perkins purple. Perkins was again an Englishman who was trying to develop, he was a scientist, and he was trying to develop quinine as a cure for malaria, and was experimenting one day and found that one of the byproducts of his experiments was this very bright purple dye. And being no fool, he immediately sold it to some Scottish mills, and they took out the copyright on it. Now, the other colours also, which he produced, was this Perkins green. So a lot of, now these have become very popular with the Queen Victoria as well. All right, so Queen Victoria and Eugénie met several times. Now, Napoleon III was very friendly with Queen Victoria. Don't forget, he'd lived for a long time in London. It was his second home. He actually went over for one of the exhibitions in London, invites Queen Victoria back. He comes over and even names one of the great avenues after the Queen Victoria. So you're now getting the fashions in Paris are now being spread over to London. But you can see what I mean. They're very, very striking, these colours. Just again, to show you that they're very unsubtle. These are bright oranges. And this is the equivalent, of course, with the Impressionists. They're also benefiting from the advances in colours in oil paints. Again, this is when I said I saw this exhibition, I took these photos. They're not quite what you expect. Do you know what I mean? There's massive patterns, and this was made popular by Eugénie. When she went over to visit Queen Victoria, she, in her crinoline, she wore a tartan as sort of homage to her ancestors Kirkpatrick and to the British Isles. And so when she came back to Paris, this was all the rage, but they sort of modified it into just looking like big checks, which looks a bit odd actually, but still. Now, again, something which was really quite interesting is this, again, that I'm emphasising, this idea of rapidity. People are now getting used to constant change. Fashions change, the city changes, ideas change, people rise in the social ladder, they fall on the social ladder. There's no longer this sort of centuries of, things happening bit by bit. Everything appears to be in a whirlwind of communications. And so your average society lady would probably have to change her clothes 4 or 5 times a day. Now, when you imagine the amount of time getting in and out of those skirts and corsets, well, of course you don't. So what they did was get into the bottom part here and be strapped into that. And in the daytime, when you're out visiting, you have the longer kind of redingote top. And for dinner that night, you actually put on a different corsage, which goes with the skirt. So this was reflecting in clothes this idea of saving time. All right, now this is one that I actually did for the Johnson collection, so some of you will have heard this before. I just wanted to make the connection between the crinoline and the way in which it affected the kind of interior design and the structure of furniture. This is in the Duc de Morny's apartment at the Louvre, which was, the Duc de Morny is the half-brother of Napoleon III, and he was one of the great ideas man behind his half-brother. They got on very well. They didn't know each other existed until Napoleon III came to power as the Prince President, and their mother sort of said, "Now, listen, dear, I've got a little surprise for you." And they managed to get on extremely well. Now, the crinolines, of course, were so huge that they couldn't be accommodated by normal chairs. So you needed very, very large, ideally curved, so that when 2 people sit down next to each other, I push my skirts that way and my friend pushes them the other way, and then we lean over and chat, all right? Otherwise, it's too difficult. Now, you'll see over here, these chairs that have arms, and you know, you have the idea of a gentleman's chair. You can actually see them in the other room. That was for men, all right, because men just had trousers and could put their arms, whereas of course a woman couldn't get into one of these chairs with a crinoline. So the equivalent for a woman was a lady's chair, which has no arms at all and is lower. These little chairs also wouldn't probably be strong enough. Well, that's a woman's chair there, to hold a crinoline. These would be for the men who would be sitting with these women who would be in chairs here. Now, I just wanted to show you also this 3 that you have here is called an indiscrète, and that's when you have 3 people who are sitting, and it's indiscreet, you see, because 2 people are trying to talk and the 3rd one's listening. But again, you can see the way which is designed so that you can have your skirt out there in different directions and still be able to talk to your girlfriend about that nice fellow who just walked into the room. Now, interior design also was very affected by this idea of monumentality, of visual culture. Things had to be seen, and they had to be enormous, and there had to be no equivocal idea behind them. They had to be magnificent, you know, nothing subtle about the Second Empire style. So you get these massive chandeliers which rain light down on this sparkling new types of materials and brocades and encrusted materials that are being manufactured now, not just hand sewn as they were for Marie Antoinette. So you can see these extraordinary brocades which probably were now manufactured at Lyon, and yards of jewels. Again, reference to this importance of staircases. Even private mansions had their own staircase where people swept up and swept down. This is actually at the Jacquemart André mansion in Paris. I want to just, this is actually the Empress Eugénie's room at the Château de Compiègne. I want to just talk about the way in which with new technology, wallpaper was being produced, which was the same as material which covered chairs, and which could be also produced as material for dresses. I just want to show you this. Now, this I think is important. Here you have, this is one of the Rothschilds wearing an extraordinary sort of material which looks very much as though it would be much better on a couch. And she's reiterating the style of the porcelain, and in fact you go one degree further. It's not a very good slide, but it does sort of show you the way in which the upholstery now is the same as the material which is worn by the woman. Now, of course, there's a message in this, isn't it? I mean, a woman is part of the interior of a house. I mean, she is one more object, you know, to be shown off to advantage, and that is where she lives. That's where she comes to life. That's where she is matched in the interior, right? So that's the important thing. There's no concessions made to women who want to go out and walk and shop for hours. No, no, no. You come to life when you're in your real realm. And I just also wanted to show you these particular outfits, which are very much towards the end of the Second Empire, right? The late 1860s, where the silhouette has changed from that enormous skirt to being brought back towards the back. And in many ways, women are being bound more, all right, than they were before. So the clothing represents attitudes to women and their place in society, as well as their place in the economy and politics of the empire. What I wanted to show you here is, again, the way in which the things that you would normally find on curtains, which are these sort of tassels and passementeries, as they're called in French, which were now being manufactured by the looms, you know, mass-produced at Lyon and even in Paris, find their way onto women's outfits, and so they again look like a walking couch. All right, now the Empress Eugénie, her political gowns by word. All right, we've already mentioned this before. Everyone had to wear white for official performances and only wear a dress once. Now, Wirt was constantly in demand. You couldn't marry your daughter, you couldn't go to any event if you weren't in a Wirt. I mean, you know, what's the point in appearing if you're not in a Wirt, you know? So he was always there behind the scenes at the last 5 minutes, you know, fixing up the bride's bows and so on. And particularly with the Empress Eugénie, she had her own apartment. She didn't live with Napoleon III after a while, in fact, most of the time. And above her apartments was a room which is nothing but her dresses. And you can imagine the size of the wardrobes, having to accommodate the dresses even without the crinolines in them. And every morning she would have a book and select what she was going to wear for what occasion. And the mannequin would be dressed up there with the dress, the petticoats, and the umbrella, the gloves, the shoes, everything, the hat, and pushed down through the floor. And it would arrive down, the outfit ready, would be taken off and put on the Empress. Now, the Empress herself, when she wasn't actually wearing these, what she calls political gowns, was quite humbly dressed. She used to wear a kind of an apron and a kind of a cloth top. Now, I'm just looking here at the Chateau de, that's the Pierrefonds. What they used to do, again, Napoleon III was very, very clear that to stay in power, he needed the support of the men who counted in his empire. And these were the rich entrepreneurs, but also the men of ideas, the scientists, the artists, the musicians, and so on. And so what they used to do each year, they would have what they called the series, and everyone would be invited for a week. 20 couples would be invited, or 20 people in their entourage would be invited for a week to stay with Eugénie and Napoleon III at the Chateau de Compiègne. That's where the armistice was signed. And they would come down by train with huge amounts of luggage, because you had to change your dress 4 times a day and you were never allowed to wear the same thing twice. So what's that, 4 by 7? That's 28 dresses at least that you had to have. And this was the idea of becoming intimate, having a relaxed relationship with the Empress and the Emperor. It was a very, very clever political move. And this went on for something like 6 weeks at Compiègne. So he went through a huge number of people, and via this networking managed to keep a lid on the political insurgencies of the time. All right, so this is them at Compiègne. In the kind of outfits that she would be wearing, all right? Very sort of, even the Emperor even sort of plays the hurdy-gurdy, and she plays the, it's all sort of supposed to be frightfully relaxed. It's quite interesting to go to Compiègne if you're actually in Paris. All right, now they visit England in 1855, and by now the kinds of clothes, her political gowns, the ones that she calls that she wears for these occasions, are exported throughout Europe. No court of Europe could possibly think of itself as being respectable or chic if it isn't wearing the Wirt brand. And so here you have the Empress Sissi, the Austrian empress, wearing, again, you can see the innovatory nature of Wirt with the spangles and the yards of tulle and so on. Princess Alexandra of Wales also wearing, and again this abundance, you've got ribbons on brocades, on different types of ribbons and bunches of ribbons, but important, the sloping shoulders. And even poor old Ferdinand and his Empress Carlotta will take the fashions down to Mexico. I'll talk about that in a minute. She, of course, dies mad at Miramar in Trieste. Do you know the story of her? I'll talk about it in a minute. Well, this is the kind of fashions also that the Empress actually had her own input. And so you get references to the fact that she is Scottish with those large tartan-type styles, but also this kind of vaguely matador-type top, referencing the fact that she, of course, is Spanish, and she loves nothing more than a bullfight. And she also is one of the people who, when she goes out to Compiègne and to Pierrefonds, she actually, being an outdoor person, wants to be able to walk, and so asks Wirt to design something to be able to pull up her skirts, and so there's little hooks on the inside which are attached inside her belt, so when she's going out she can actually pull the dress up, and the same thing for the petticoat. So it's quite an ingenious method of being able to circulate. But again, this is very much like reference to the sort of Spanish bolero that the matadors would have worn. Now, the Empress, of course, now is a role model in all ways. She's a political, glamorous, the sense of sovereignty, the power of the empire. Here she is with the one child that she has and the Emperor. I don't know where this is, at Fontainebleau, I think, with the Siamese embassy ambassadors crawling along to give them gifts. So this is this idea of you know, the colonial power of France. But she's also very careful to play the role of the dutiful wife, because don't forget, the people who count and have the power in Paris at the moment are the bourgeoisie. These are the great bankers, the Rothschilds, the Perez and the others. Napoleon III can do nothing without these people, and in fact they're going to be the ones that bring down his empire. There's going to be a feud between two Jewish banking groups, the Perret and the Rothschilds. The Perret were the people who were backing Baron Haussmann in his reconstruction of Paris. When they collapse due to pressure from the Rothschilds, they bring Haussmann down, and parallel will bring down the Second Empire. There will be other things as well. But this bourgeoisie then is important, and so she must play the role of the bourgeois wife, sort of hanging devotedly on his arm. Now, in fact, he was notorious for his affairs. Notorious. I mean, whenever he went to the opera, he'd have his scouts out looking for, you know, nice little new fillies, and they'd be told, "You've been chosen tonight, dear, you know, get undressed, loosen the stays, kiss him anywhere but not on the face," and so on. And Eugénie would just be sitting there when he disappears. I mean, after years she would have surely got the picture, but it got really very, very embarrassing. For example, when they would go down to the beach at Biarritz, she would go down with the whole court, and they were out promenading one day, and this little dog ran up and started jumping on Napoleon III, and it turned out it was Marguerite Bélanger's little pet dog, who obviously knew the Empress so well. That was number one, that was the problem. The second one was it obviously meant Marguerite Bélanger was there, and for once in her life the Empress really lost her cool, went home, packed her bags and said, "I'm back to Paris, you can, you know, do what you like." So there was a little bit of few red faces there for a while. She actually probably had a son by Napoleon III, and here she's saying, and Marguerite Bélanger and her son doux seigneur, her great lord. So she also must promote the image of herself as an exemplary mother, all right? Remember, women were mothers, not sexual creatures. You had the prostitutes for that. So there's a huge number of portraits done by her, which are very reminiscent of those portraits of Marie Antoinette. I've only got about another 10 minutes, okay? Well, people obviously sort of on their blocks. So there we have this portrait of the little Prince Imperial. And you have photography at this time, and I think this is what makes these Eugénie in many ways quite a compelling person, because you no longer have quite the same political agenda behind the artists who produce those pictures of Josephine and Marie Antoinette. Admittedly, any pose, of course, is staged, but you do actually get this very, very interesting pose here, which is very reminiscent of the Madonna and Child. Very, very, and of course when you remember the profound Catholicism of Eugénie, you realise that this does play a part of it. It's a very interesting photograph actually. You never saw this blank area over there, and the two people sort of in a kind of a strange sort of triangle in the corner, with the great massive crinoline really forming a kind of background. Again, posing as the happy family. Right? Now this is something that, and that's what it's supposed to represent. It's no longer just regality that we had with Marie Antoinette. In fact, you rarely got portraits of the Queen and the King and the children. In fact, I don't think you did. it was always one or the other, whereas here it's like the bourgeois family unit, and the bourgeois did not have many children. Birth control was much more advanced in France than anywhere else in Europe. The Pope was furious. He was always having people come down. So the one child would have been seen as quite normal. There's actually quite a dramatic difference in the appearance of Napoleon III. He was very, very ill. He suffered from massive kidney stones. What else? He had prostate cancer. He had epilepsy. I don't know. He had really debilitating diseases, and was always strapped into a corset himself. In the end, when he was actually fighting at Sedan, the last battle that he will fight, he rides out on his horse. He's in such agony from these kidney stones. He just hopes that someone will kill him. Finally, when he goes into exile, he will be operated on, but dies from the operation. So this is one of the reasons he's looking rather pained. But very much the sort of, notice the way she's gazing at the child and holding onto the child's hands, very much this sort of, Madonna and child. But of course also religion here, we get now portraits which are photographic portraits, she's still very much the empress, very much with a Josephine type veil, but in the prayer position, all right, promoting Catholicism, the importance, the power of the church. And we'll see this was very important because she had a very strong position. She was what they called an ultramontanist. This was a movement within the Catholic Church which supported the infallibility of the Pope, and there had always been a clash in France between the Gallic Catholic Church and the Roman Catholic Church, and she champions the Roman Catholic Church against the Gallic Church, and so that is a source of quite a number of problems within France. And she will urge her husband, Napoleon III, to constantly attempt to prop up tottering monarchs who are Roman Catholics, as we'll see in a moment. Now, this is her young son. This is the only child, Prince Louis Napoleon. This memento mori. This was a thing that people sent out when someone died. You actually had a photograph like a visiting card photograph done of you and sent out to anyone who couldn't get to the funeral. Now, the irony of this, of course, is that in 1870, at the Battle of Sedan, Napoleon III is defeated and goes back into exile from whence he came, with his wife and with his son. And the young prince will grow up. I think he goes to, what is it, the military college, Sandhurst, yeah, and becomes a member of a crack group of soldiers who are sent off to fight the Zulus, of all things, and of course rather overestimated his own ability, as I think a lot of these princes do, and led an attack against a huge group of Zulus and was killed. So the irony, of course, is that you have the last heir to the imperial throne of France dies as an English soldier and is buried in England, as is Napoleon III. Now, what else did Eugénie have to do? She had to show herself as the sort of the dispenser of good deeds. Right? This is again being held down, coming down from the Queen. Here she is visiting the cholera epidemic. She opens up a number of orphanages, and in fact, when the young prince is born, the city of Paris is going to give her a huge amount of money. She says, no, I want that to be given to help the plight of other babies who are born perhaps at this same day, but which aren't as fortunate as my Louis. So there's a very, very large orphanage up in the 9th arrondissement, which still exists today. She insisted on going to Corsica, taking the poor little prince everywhere with him, showing him people who were blind. Very much this sort of socialist sort of doctrine that her husband had had. It was a very strange sort of empire. You know, on the one hand, you've got this magnificence and overspending, but there's sort of also a kind of fundamental ideas, socialist ideas that they had as well. Napoleon III built a whole lot of apartment houses for workers and so on. Oh yes, I just want to sort of say also, she, there's a great animal painter at the time, a representative called Rosa Bonheur, who refused to wear women's clothes. I think she was a lesbian, you know, and quite open about it. And this is at a time when a woman, to wear trousers, you actually had to have a piece of paper from the town hall to say you're allowed to do it. Georges Sand had to get this dispensation, for example. And she was awarded, she's a wonderful painter, and Eugénie intervenes and says, why is it there are no women who have the Legion of Honour for painting? And it is at Eugénie's instigation that she's given the Legion of Honour. And then, of course, Bois Bonheur says, well, you know, you can do what you like with the Legion of Honour. I'm not getting into a dress to come and get it. And so Eugénie actually makes sure they waive the fact. And you have a woman arriving at the ceremony, a woman getting the Legion of Honour in the first place, but coming in trousers. And again, this is Eugénie who champions her cause, not unlike really Marie Antoinette championing Vigée Lebrun. Well, one of the disasters, I suppose, of the reign, there were many, but on the whole, Eugénie holds her rank, moves with the times from crinoline to the next kind of dress, aloof but engaged, never a whiff of scandal, as opposed to the other two divas who we've been mentioning. However, her desire to see Roman Catholicism throughout the world arises, at least eventually means that she will push her husband to put on the throne of Mexico a puppet monarchy. Now, this was a time when Europe and the Roman Catholics in particular were very worried about the result of the American Civil War, where it looked as though the North were going to win and would then turn their attention to Mexico. And so the idea was to intervene before these sort of Protestant-led Anglo-Saxons could penetrate down south. And after a certain amount of deliberation, they convince one of the cousins of the Habsburg family, a certain Maximilian, the Emperor Max. Now, he's an interesting character. He was very interested in botany. He was the first Austrian sailor to circumnavigate the globe, and he looks completely different from his brothers and sisters. And it is actually thought that he is the illegitimate son of, wait for it, Napoleon II. All right, now, who was Napoleon II? Napoleon I you all know about. His son, when Napoleon I dies and is in exile, goes back to Austria with his mother and will never reign. Actually, he dies at the age of 22 or 23. And so when Napoleon III, that we're talking about today, comes to power, he takes the name Napoleon III out of deference for this young prince who has died in exile. However, this young prince was very close to the Queen Sophia, and as I said, this child looks completely different and has many of the characteristics of Napoleon Bonaparte. This interest in science, this drive and push. Anyway, that's just a very interesting aside. Anyhow, whatever happens, he comes to a very sticky end. He's chosen and he doesn't want to be put on the throne, doesn't want to go down, but he and his young bride, Carlotta, who was one of his distant cousins, are sent down to Mexico. Now, he has many liberal ideas. He tries to get the rebels on side by granting them land. It's all very disastrous, but he's supported by the French army. When Napoleon III is now, we're getting towards 1869, having trouble in Europe with the Prussians, and he has to withdraw his army, and it is obvious that this puppet regime is going to collapse. Carlotta returns to Napoleon III, begs, cries, anything, please, don't abandon us, and in fact actually goes mad. And she's interned then in what is now in Trieste. There's a magnificent sort of castle called Miramare, which belonged to his family, and she was interned in a kind of, not exactly a shed, but a little part at the back, stark raving mad. Napoleon III pulls back his troops, and Maximilian, who is a very honourable man, says, I cannot abandon the people who have supported me, and indeed he and his supporters are lined up and shot. Now, this, of course, is the painting by Manet, who is criticising the regime of Napoleon III, and this character is supposed to look a little bit like Napoleon III, and of course it is referencing the Dos Meus, the Goya painting of the uprising against the French in Spain. So there's a lot of things that are going on in that painting. All right, anyway, that was really Eugénie who has pushed her husband into that, and there was a lot of criticism. She actually sort of says, you know, c'est ma guerre, it's my war, you know, I want the war, I'll lead it, and so on. And the people were saying, oh, she's just sort of, you know, annoyed because he's having affairs with everybody else. I think it's rather sort of facile interpretation. Anyhow, she represents in 1869, when Napoleon III is already very, very ill and embroiled in other military campaigns. It is she who officiates at the opening of the Suez Canal. A massive amount of money had been put in by the French government with Ferdinand Lesseps, who has the idea, which originally was put about by Napoleon I. It was his idea when he went over that you could actually connect the two continents by the canal. And Lesseps actually unearths this idea and carries it out. Well, in 1870, we get the defeat of Napoleon III. This is him with Bismarck. The French, how did they not know it was coming? At the exhibition of a few years before, you had the massive cannons, Krupp's cannons, which were at the French exhibition, and the French very nicely gave them a gold medal. And of course, a few years later, they will be trained on France or on Paris itself. Well, in 1870, what happens? You get the defeat of the Second Empire. Napoleon goes back into exile in 1870, 1871. Now, what happens here is quite important. The French government sign a treaty with the Prussians. The Parisians themselves say that they will not accept and ratify the surrender of Paris. And the French government, which is now the Republican government, is driven out of Paris and takes up its headquarters at Versailles. And for a certain amount of time, this is after the siege that had been laid on Paris for months by the Prussians, people had virtually starving to death. Now there is going to be civil war. The Parisians, who formed the Commune, drag cannons that they've captured up to the heights of Montmartre and say that they will defend Paris against their own government who want to take it back. So you've got the Prussians outside doing a kind of Monty Python, scratching their head as the French virtually fight to the death. Eventually, it is a time, I don't know if you know that song, Le Temps des Cerises, you know, talking about the sort of wonderful sort of time. It seems for a few short months that there really is liberté, égalité, fraternité. Everyone mixes in Paris. People build the barricades, and the barricades are across all parts of the great boulevards. They're even across the Place de la Concorde, and they're manned by all layers of French society. However, what happens is that the Versaillais managed to get into Paris through an unguarded gate. And what was happening at the time was that there wasn't much food. People were drinking a lot of absinthe. There wasn't a great amount of rigour, shall we say, in the guarding of the outposts. The French government troops, the Versaillais, get in and start fighting street by street. And here you see these are the people with the Boulevard de Clichy around here with the barricade there. It is the bloodiest possible fighting. Now I think within La Semaine Sanglante, the Bloody Week, there are 50,000 people die. 50,000 people die. Another 5,000 are sent out to New Caledonia. Countless thousands are slaughtered without any sort of trial. And here you see them being lined up. Can you see the number of them are being lined up? And some were really shot by the French troops. So this was one of the sort of it was much worse. More people died in a short amount of time than the French Revolution, the Revolution of 38, yes, the 30 and 48. What was it? What was the ferocity? Why did you have this extraordinary sort of outcome? Because even when these people realised that they were beaten, they were going to destroy Paris. And they set alight the Tuileries Palace, they set alight the Palais de Saint-Cloud, where you now have the Musée d'Orsay, the arts centre there was burnt down, the town hall, the Hôtel de Ville was razed. Paris was burning. It really was the revenge of the working class against the bourgeoisie. It was all about property and class. It wasn't really about political idealism. And these people who were the outsiders, for a moment had, you know, a couple of months had seen this idyllic life, and then were going to be crushed again by this class of bourgeois, and they wanted to destroy the Paris of the Second Empire, which was the Paris of the bourgeoisie. So these are the paintings of these people shot down in the streets. Well, during this time, Eugénie, by 1880, is now safely in exile. She actually escaped with the help of her dentist. It always shows you always be polite to your dentist. And she now is still the most respectable person. Can you see she's now, by now Napoleon III has died from his operation, and so she is in mourning. Very different from the mourning of Marie Antoinette. It's much more sober. Even the extremely contained body language, and also the big difference here, of course, is that we now have so-called true images of people, which are photographic images. You no longer have interpretations as you did with Marie Antoinette when she was in mourning. She has the widow's coif, not looking remarkably different. Later on, again wearing these kinds of crinolines, or at least outfits that have very heavy braiding on the outside. And finally, she, of course, the French imperial family has been outlawed. You know, when at 1870, at their defeat, they were never allowed to go back into France. And the Third Republic finally secretly allows the Empress, when she's 90, to come back in incognito, and she goes back to the Chateau de Compiègne and sort of sees, you know, where she had these séries, where she had, you know, put forward the great fashions of Worth, and where she had been the incarnation of the empire. At the age of 94, she goes from her last trip down to Spain and actually dies in Spain. Here you can still see very much the face of that imperious lady who rarely put a foot wrong in this extraordinary reign, from rising from the aristocracy, impoverished though it may be, of Spain, to being the icon of Europe and the world. In many ways, she is the first fashion icon that goes to the New World. And probably even you get in Australia, you would even have had fashions coming out via the catalogues of the great shops. So at the death of Eugénie, getting back to my main theme, the crinoline had gone. It was well gone, just the way the Second Empire had been well gone. In other words, that style, which was the incarnation of the greatness, the expansion and the solidity of the empire, disappears because it is no longer a viable metaphor for the political situation which had taken over afterwards. Thank you.